Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Data Standard Audio Experience. My name is Catherine Tao, and today we're here with Anita Ward, the CDO at Salary Finance. And today we're going to be speaking about anthropology and data. So welcome to the show, Anita. I'm very excited to have you today.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for including me.
Yeah, of course. And could you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. So you're right. I am the Chief Development and Diversity Officer for Salary Finance. And I come to it, I've been with the organization. We're a UK-based organization. We launched in 2015, and we're focused on financial inclusion and really the democratization of financial services into markets that have been underserved. And the way we do that is by scaling through employers. And I joined in December of 2019, which meant that by the time I was really excited about what we were going to do, that we had a global pandemic. So I'm really excited about what we're able to do now. But Catherine, I tell you that because I really frame my passion around financial inclusion based on my personal story. And I grew up as a young child in Pennsylvania, most of the time homeless. So we couch surf between family and friends and shelters and wherever we could at the time. And I think by the time I was 16, we had lived in 13 different cities and locations. And at one point we hopped in, my parents put us in a U-Haul and took us from Pennsylvania to Las Vegas looking for better opportunities. But what happened was we ended up living in that U-Haul for a bit of time in the Mojave Desert until we landed on our feet in an apartment. My parents borrowed one of those payday loans, which got them stuck in a cycle of debt from which they had trouble escaping. None of us had any real financial literacy, but I was fortunate enough that I landed a job at McDonald's. And I think McDonald's tagline is still America's first job. But I'm grateful because there they taught me about financial literacy. So the manager, and I think it probably was a franchise now that I reflect back on it, but the manager of that location on Maryland Parkway leaned in. He explained what my check meant. He explained, what the taxes were. This was all a new language to me. It might as well have been Latin because the language of money just wasn't intuitive. So it was through this employer that I gained my financial literacy. And in many ways, McDonald's gave me my financial dignity and helped my family. So it was just a question of, yes, they gave me food I could take home in the evenings, but more importantly, they gave me financial resilience and something that then helped me through the rest of my career. So when we talk about financial inclusion, for me, I know there's lots of Anitas and lots of families like my own, and so much need for companies like Salary Finance and the nonprofits and the financial services sector to really address.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Anita, for sharing your story about just being homeless and the hardship that you had. And it's so great to hear that you're in a great position now. And it's great to hear your journey of where you are today. So thank you so much for sharing.
Of course. I think what's important, because I'm an anthropologist, like you said. So my doctorate really is a combination in that science around qualitative and quantitative. So I'm a bit of a data freak, admittedly. But when I reflect back and combine my personal journey with data and then look at it through the lens of diversity and equity and inclusion, the data is pretty compelling, Catherine. 76% of personal loan applicants are declined. So think 76%. And then if you look at that and you place that within buffers, like savings buffers, 65% of American households lack a savings buffer of only 6 weeks of income. And then because of the way I view the world in all these crazy kaleidoscopic lenses, I look at it from the perspective of people of color. And you have 73% of African Americans don't have that savings plan. 70% of Hispanic households. And you realize that the DEI lens, when you place that on economic fragility, we definitely have a problem in our country, both one that reeks of systemic issues, but also one that absolutely needs to be addressed. So at Salary Finance, what we're doing is really taking action. And so you'll like this, being the data standard, I think you'll like this, but we conduct annual research and publish it. It's called Inside the Wallets of Working Americans. So anybody who wants to access it can, but we also open source the data. So open source the raw data. We think that it's important that if you could get collaborations between organizations and social scientists and advocates and community organizers and really create diversity of thought and analysis against that raw data, and all of us mining it from different perspectives, that I think the insights will become quite compelling, because we're looking at financial stressors. So we, from our perspective in financial services, are trying to understand what are the pressures that people are experiencing. Are they savings pressures? Are they credit score pressures? And then by publishing that data, we can see where we have particular geographies that are in trouble or demographics that are in trouble, and then can place action against that or create new products to help that specific demographic. So for us, data and research and access to data and collaboration around data is just the most important thing that we could do, I think, to address particularly DEI initiatives, but almost to address any product development at the end of the day. So we put active partnerships in place with the conscious capitalism groups. Conscious capitalism movement is critical, I think, as you start building purpose-driven organizations. And what John Mackey and Whole Foods and Raj Sisodia over at Babson did early on with conscious capitalism is remarkable. We've teamed up with the PwC CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion, signed the pledge, and we lead the financial services team. We're working with Anita Ward. We partner with community organizations. And so when I think about data, I never think about data in the absence of partnerships, collaboration, and something that's actionable, which I think is probably the way the data standard looks at it as well, or at some level, similar way.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. And definitely the data standard is all about just helping other people be able to network and collaborate and just be an inclusive environment for everybody. Absolutely. And I wanted to also touch on your background about anthropology. And so how does your anthropology background really help view data through just multiple lenses?
I love anthropology. So I probably am on the video, I think you'll probably get this big grin, but I studied at University of California, Santa Barbara, and I will never forget the day that I went to work for Occidental Petroleum and most of my friends went somewhere exotic. So my view of anthropology is really within the workplace in an applied sense. But anthropology is rooted in ethnography and the idea that you're collecting data and understanding without judgment what a culture and organization is. So when you think about anthropology, whether it's Papua New Guinea or the employees of Tesla or Oxy, in my case, you're really still looking at societies. So you're viewing that data through the lens of culture, through values, through behaviors, and you're creating this picture of what is that organization or that community or that society all about. And the models are really quite different. So we just talked about Whole Foods. What John created early on with Whole Foods is an incredible model driven by purpose and values and acceptance. There are other organizations that have very different values and potentially they're driven by other needs and other values. But the people, they live within those behaviors and values, but they come to work having been influenced by, just like me, my family and my ethnicity and my community or religious beliefs or my passions. And when I come to work at Tesla or Whole Foods, I'm not checking that behavior at the door, right? So what happens is you get this incredible amalgamation of the corporate culture, and then each of us bringing our individual values to the table as well. And so what anthropology does when you're starting to look at the data is it says, it's important to understand the context. So for me, I hope you guys agree with this, but data without context is just simply data, right? It's meaningless in my mind. So all my social media friends are regaling content is king. my position is that context is king. And I would argue that, without the context around it, you have just a blurry understanding of what the data means. And it's really nothing more than just, we both lived in Southern California at one point, but it's really nothing more than what I think of as data smog. So anthropology helps you sort of peel away that smog, understands what's happening, set the context around the data, and then look at it through a myriad of lenses without judgment. So we're trained to be participant observance, not to become so involved that we're actually affecting results. So in many ways, I think anthropologists were some of the first data scientists in the way that we approach our understandings of cultures and organizations.
Yeah, definitely. Great explanation and insight there. And I also wanted to ask, so how are you kind of finding more people at that intersection of data science and social sciences, since these are two very different fields, and it's so interesting to hear from your perspective, just the intersection and your line of work. And so how are you finding more people, like kind of similarly to you?
Yes. So 25 years ago now, when I started, there was not on any box on an org chart that said cultural anthropologist, or even data scientist at that point, right? So there really wasn't an acceptance of that intersection at all. And still, in many ways, there are purists who are very much the researchers and academicians that we desperately need. But there's a growing field, particularly in anthropology, around applied anthropology. So there are other crazy scientists like me who think that that there's a need to study cultures and organizations within companies or within cities. So there's a growing movement around applied anthropology. I think sociologists have been doing this for a long time as well. And of course, the organization development world with OD psychologists, they've been working in HR departments for a long time. But I think there is less judgment around it. But I also think, Catherine, that 2020 kind of pointed out the need. So while I complain a lot about the pandemic, when you start looking about the role of a data scientist or the role of a social scientist in the world of economic development, COVID-19 pointed out how desperate we are and how important it is to have both data, both quantitative and qualitative data. So there are a couple things that I think about, but my nephew, for example, is in the Hamilton cast in LA. They were unemployed. Broadway shut down. So I got very close to what it was like in the unemployment claims, because we had backlogs in unemployment claims in this country. People had no money. They couldn't survive. We didn't have an infrastructure. We didn't have the data. We really hadn't built the strong underpinnings of either the quantitative or qualitative pieces. So suddenly there's this heightened perception and awareness of how important data and technology are, but then also a heightened awareness of how important it is to understand it through the social lens, or the schools closing. What did that mean? What is distance learning? We were so ill prepared. But we also didn't understand the data that sat behind free and reduced lunches, for example. So kids were getting their only meals at school. School shuts down. Now you don't just have an internet accessibility problem, you have a food access problem. Now, so if you look at scientists, if you look at the data, you've got social scientists who are already working in those school closings. You've already got social scientists who are working on policy and advocacy. You've got data scientists who are working at the other end. And I think the pandemic brought very new and much more interesting collaborations together to start to help shape public policy. So in many ways, like much of my career, by the way, it was accidental. And I think the pandemic drove that heightened awareness around people like anthropologists who bring a very different kind of an understanding to the table. But I also think it created these really outstanding and diverse collaborations that get us to that same end, whether it's trying to get the vaccine through, or collapse the time for a clinical trial, or simply support a group. You have scientists working with policymakers, working with government officials, working with heads of corporations. I think it's a really solid change that was driven by, sadly, a tragedy.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great to hear from your perspective, just knowing that, we just were not prepared for all the claims that were coming in about unemployment. And we really just didn't know how to handle the situation. It's interesting
Yeah.
to see how we were able to get through it eventually. And things are getting, I think, a bit better now with just more job opportunities being out there and things opening up now also. And it's great to hear that your line of work, you really have to be empathetic and really understand everybody from the social sciences side of your background.
Yes, at Salary Finance, it's a really interesting model because we challenged the financial services sector. And what we said was people need access to affordable credit. What my parents, as I shared, got stuck in that cycle of debt because of predatory lending. But we look at data like credit scores, and we say credit scores have been this driver for qualification for a personal loan. Is there a different way to look at this? Can we look at it through a behavioral lens? So early on in Salary Finance, as we started to build our algorithms for lending, we said, let's take a look at tenure. So if you're on the job for a few years, isn't that an example of character? And can't character represent better whether somebody's going to actually pay back a loan, whether they're a lower risk? And isn't that a better indicator than your credit score? So you might have missed a few payments, or your utilization might be high on your MasterCard, but it's because you took a lovely vacation. We don't know what sits behind that, but we know if your utilization is high and if you've missed a payment here or there, your credit score is low. It doesn't mean you're not going to pay back your loan. It's really not in our algorithms the deciding factor. Ours is really a shift toward how long have you been on the job? We're looking at behavioral economics characteristics, and that broadens our ability to be much more inclusive in how we lend. So we're not using credit scores in the process. We're using your job, we're using your tenure, we're using your lifestyle, we're using you and looking at you as a holistic individual. And I believe that that's really the kind of thinking that is going to break traditional bonds on how we do, whether it's financial services or anything else, frankly. Again, back to the context of the data. A credit score is data, but if you don't understand the context or what that data represents, then you're not going to make a decision that's sound, in the same way that the lending decision is data. But again, aggregating all of this together and looking at tenure, that is a representation of responsibility. You've stayed on the job for 5 years. You should get that gold pin with that little ruby in it. Plus, you should have access to affordable credit at 5.9% or whatever that is. So that's the way we see it. And I think it's a cultural piece, but it's definitely a focus on values that we think is much more important and much more inclusive.
Absolutely. And Anita, it's so great to hear just your background and really the intersection of anthropology and data and just the work that you do. I wanted to say thank you so much, Anita, for joining the show today. Where can everyone find you online to connect with you?
At salaryfinance.com. Please go check out who we are and what we do. I would say thank you to the data standard, because for me and the next generation, I think data should inform our moral compass. And that is an area where we haven't really taken data in the past. So these unique collaborations and are so fortunate. And I'm grateful to you for including me in your podcast today, Catherine. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much, Anita. It was such a pleasure to have you and just hear more about your story. And I hope to speak to you again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Catherine.